Welcome once again to Ewtn's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host, our guest author, Gary Michuta. And the book is The Gospel Truth, How We Can Know What Christ Taught, Emmaus Road Publishing. And it's available naturally through our Ewtn religious catalog, ewtnrc.com for all things Catholic. Good to see you again, Gary. I think it's been a while for us, but people have seen you on the network on and off. You were on with Father Mitch recently, and in fact, you were talking about the same thing, the gospel truth, how we can know what Christ taught. What made you decide to focus on this particular topic?
Yeah, I think it's because where people are today, many people don't know who Jesus is. They may have heard his name used as a swear word, but that's about it. And so his name kind of blends into the background. And there's been a lot of really great work done by evangelicals to vindicate the Gospels and so on, but I've always found them to be very hollow. So I wanted to write a book that would be accessible to somebody who's maybe curious about this Jesus. Actually, I want to make them curious. That's the whole thing. And I want to show that there's something different about the Gospels, that this isn't folklore or myth, but it's something that was very carefully crafted in order to pass on accurate information.
Right. Do you think part of the issue for people, where more people kind of know who Jesus is, or at least who Jesus is supposed to be, but believe kind of the gospel is some nice stories, right. But I mean, it's not history. It's like you said, myth, folklore rolled together, just like the Greeks or something else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so what I want to do in the book is to get them to say, huh, like, that's curious. First, I started off the book with Jesus of Nazareth, a very curious character that popped up during some suicidal revolts by the Jews based on an oracle. And was the oracle false? Was it true? And why is he the only one that seems to fill that? Then I move on to taking a look at the Gospels and see if we see any evidence whether they did want to pass on information. And I look at the Jewish background, rabbinical training, and how you can see that in the Gospels. And I go into all sorts of memory devices that are embedded in the text. So the reason why they're there is so that they can reproduce information accurately. So this is something Jesus must have engineered. He must have gave it in this format. It was recorded and passed on, so that there's an integrity to what's.
You mean memorization's a good thing?
Oh yeah, I know.
Somebody should tell the education's departments over the last 50 years who decided it wasn't such a good thing. Who is Flavius Josephus, and why is he important to you? You start right off in the book quoting him.
Yeah, he's a first century Jewish historian, wrote about 100 AD, and he was actually a participant in the first Jewish revolt. And why that's important is because he switches sides. He joins the Romans.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, he joins the Romans.
That's why some people like to question what he has to say about things, right?
Right. So in a way, he doesn't have skins in the game as far as, trying to come up with excuses for the Jews. He will lay it out. And he talks about this, that the first revolt was a result of an oracle, an ancient oracle that someone would come in the first century who would achieve worldwide dominion. And he says the Jews foolishly thought it was speaking about one of them, but actually he thought it was speaking about the Roman Empire, emperors. So
where did this oracle, you referenced the oracle, was that like the Oracle Delphi or something, or where did this oracle come from?
No, it seems to come from the book of Daniel.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Daniel has like a chronological thing where it seems like the Messiah would come around the first century.
Okay.
And he also speaks of the Son of Man, that the Son of Man figure will approach the Ancient of Days, who's God, and be given universal dominion that will last forever. And so that's what he's hearkening. And when you look at Josephus and you look at the New Testament, you do find in the first century a lot of people claiming to be Messiah. They all gather, lots of people, followers, they get killed, and then they disperse, they disappear. All except for Christians.
Unlike Jesus, obviously.
Exactly.
Right. And you actually talk about the two Jewish revolts, the one in at 66 to 73 and then the later revolt in the next century. You said the Jews weren't the only ones to believe in the oracle, but the oracle spoke of a Jewish leader, not a pagan or Gentile. You say Suetonius, who was a historian, only talked about disturbances in Rome being caused by a certain Jew named Christus, okay? Because your goal is to show that there's historical background to not only Christ but the Gospels, right? You go on to say from a certain Christus who was executed by Pontius Pilate. That's Tacitus talking about that. Josephus also wrote about this person who was called Christ, that he worked wondrous signs, and his followers continued even after his death, which you're putting out as saying, if these things didn't happen, why would they continue after his death?
Exactly. That's one of those questions. It's like, how odd that Christianity didn't end like all the other false messiahs and claimants to that. And of course, those Roman historians thought that they was talking about Vespasian and Titus.
Right.
And what's ironic is, if you ask people today, what's the Roman Empire, probably half of them never heard of the Roman Empire, and much less Vespasian or Titus. So
no,
they couldn't possibly.
They might have heard
them.
of Julius Caesar, Augustus, maybe I Claudius. They might have watched on television, or Caligula, or Nero. Those would be the names. After that, it all gets lost.
Yeah, they weren't even important as far as emperors were concerned. Right.
But they were the earliest ones. You say at one time nature or genre of these four Gospels was hotly debated in scholarly circles. However, today's scholars have concluded that the Gospels fall into a literary genre of ancient lives, which you call a biography.
Yeah.
Why is that important to understand?
Yeah, because as you know, the first person to come out with the news, that becomes what everybody knows. And usually when it's retracted, people don't pay attention to
the retraction is usually on the back page. That's part of the reason
Exactly.
why.
So when critical scholarship was just getting out of the gates, the initial analysis was these are folklore legends like you find in other cultures. So there might be a tiny kernel of history, but it's mostly embellishments. But scholarship has come to the point now that they say, no, the Gospels fit much better into a genre of biography or contemporary history, which is like the best kind of ancient historiography you can get. And so, unfortunately, like I said, the news got out. People think, oh, it's just folklore or myth. But actually, scholarship today is, no, this appears to be contemporary biography. And
you mean contemporary in the sense of people who are contemporaries of Jesus at the time that he walked the earth, and our belief of his resurrection, and obviously who saw the things that he did, or around at the time and talked to the same people who saw those things, right?
Yeah, and Josephus, which we mentioned earlier, in Against Appian, he says that is the best kind of historiography. So here you have a Jewish historian who says to actually be at the events or interview people who were at the events, that's really the best kind of histories. And so I think that's why in the next chapter I go into Jewish culture, because if the Jews understood the importance of history, it's like, well, what else can we learn about the Gospels?
Right, it's interesting too, because you make the point that within their culture, the Jews place a premium on the production of continuous contemporary recording of events.
Yeah.
And so the idea was that they were big on tracking these things as they occurred, or close to the events themselves, not just looking back and trying to remember something that happened 20 years ago.
Yeah, continuous record keeping. And although it's not so much that they were close to the events, but it seems like they just always had a continuous record going on. So you can see that in the Old Testament.
Is that because of the fact that they were the way it got passed on from one to the other?
Yeah.
And you talk about that mnemonically, and with language and the rhythm and the rhyme, and looking at if you get behind the Greek into the Hebrew or whatever, you can see more of that when you talk about in the book, where certain words that in Greek or in English don't have any representation or look similar, but if you look at the underlying Hebrew, the three words used in this thing are all the same except for one letter being slightly different.
Exactly.
And so for that person, there would be an alliteration there, which eases the ability to remember something, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. You say Jesus of Nazareth lived within a culture that formalized and refined the means by which large amounts of religious instruction could be reliably passed on from generation to generation. And then you talk about our Lord Jesus in the rabbi-disciple relationship, and how understanding that is a way to understand how our Lord dealt with his disciples.
Yeah, and that's something that a lot of scholars miss, and I think it's an important component. Jesus didn't just come and wing it. He deliberately formed the people, right, the Jews, in such a way that there was already a mechanism, because they were an oral culture. They weren't really a written culture, although they did a lot of writing. And so there's the rabbi-disciple relationship was a way in which they could pass on vast amounts of legislation and teaching accurately from generation to generation. And what I do in the book is I outline the basic components of that, and then I show in the Gospels that you can actually see that work in the Gospels.
Yeah, you mentioned that the idea of picking a rabbi, because Paul was he was from one school versus another school. That would be there. The importance of who you would pick, and the fact that once you would become one of their students, how obligated you would be to their teaching.
Yeah, yeah, and in later rabbinic literature, it's actually you would pay more honor to the teacher than you would your parent or your father. Right. Which, of course, that comes up to the commandment: honor your father and mother. Right. The rabbi actually had more prestige. And
that's where you talk about the story of the rich young man, or the man who's going to bury his father,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
That sense of where the rabbi is actually more important than the father.
Yes, yes. So that's a difficult passage that trips up people. But if you look at it in terms of the rabbi-disciple relationship, it makes perfect sense.
Right.
Jesus isn't saying anything new or out of the ordinary, really.
Right. And some people also talk about the idea that he still had an attachment to this world that ultimately he was needed to break away from.
Yeah.
So, the duty of disciples to retain everything the rabbi taught and not to go beyond it. I thought this was, and you have a listing of 5 things particular author Schurer pointed out, but you said instruction was dispositional. What did that mean?
It was like a law court or a law school. So the disciples would ask questions of the rabbi, legal questions, and of course the rabbi would ask them questions. And boy, you can't read a couple of pages in the New Testament without somebody posing somebody a question.
Right, questions. And the typical rabbinical question, our Lord asking questions back to them.
Yes.
The disciples' duty was to keep everything faithfully in memory. The other thing was he was never to teach anything otherwise that was delivered to him, even to the point of copying expressions used by his teacher. Yeah. But you also say that they just didn't parrot everything. It's still, there was a certain level of interpretation coming through that person. We have to accept that too, right?
Yeah, but in my work in apologetics, I found cases where I've talked to people who were avid followers of a particular preacher, and when I talk to them, when they're referring to what he says, they actually pick up the accent and the mannerisms of that teacher. So that's fun, because if you think about the apostles, I'm sure they probably literally imitated Jesus on occasion.
Right. I thought this was interesting. You talk about repetition in the gospel, and the idea of repetition being good for memorization, but also the idea that one possibility of repetition may be Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and his Sermon on the Plain, one in Matthew, one in Luke. It's often thought the gospel copied the other and changed the location and altered some of the words. You say a more parsimonious answer would be that Jesus repeated essentially the same sermon twice in 2 different locations for 2 different crowds, which of course would make sense. It's not like somebody recorded that and they were passing his recording around to the rest of the people in Palestine.
Yeah,
right?
That's true. Well, stenography did exist, so it's possible somebody could have jotted notes.
Right.
But if he's a good rabbi and it follows the traits of a rabbi, Jesus would repeat a lot. Now the problem is, for the gospel writers, it's laborious, it's expensive, and you don't want to read a lot of repetition, so a lot of that probably was expunged.
Right.
So, but I think that might be a case of repetition right there.
Right. Well, it would make sense that he would have the same sermon to various people because he's talking to a different group of people. You say, we're not arguing that the Gospels are truthful because they say they're truthful, nor are we arguing that Jesus utilized the rabbi-disciple relationship in the Gospels, said he did so. Whether we're looking at these ancient biographies to see whether, in broad terms, they present Jesus as using this Jewish form of transmission, which you believe he did.
Yeah, I think so. It's hard to miss those traits.
Now, in the chapter 3, that's not Greek to me. The earliest manuscripts possessed of the Gospels are written in Greek, and then there's something strange about the Greek Gospels. What's strange about it?
Yeah, because occasionally they'll speak as if they're not speaking Greek, like Aramaic or Hebrew. Kind of like, with America, you'll have accents. People that language isn't English, the first language isn't English. They'll change the word order or use something that's not conventional English.
Right.
And you find that in the Gospels.
Right, almost like a Spanglish would show up or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Where somebody would say, well, that's not quite English and that's not quite Spanish.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Why would someone writing in Greek include phrases that his readers probably wouldn't understand? You say the Gospels are peppered with Semitisms or turns of phrase as well. I thought that was interesting, where there are these like Hebrew phrases that again are underlying the Greek that somebody who would have heard it originally in the Aramaic or in the Hebrew would have understood what that phrase meant.
Yeah, yeah. And there's like a style fullness to how Hebrews speak. Like you'll see this in the Gospels where it says Jesus stood up and went, or he looked up and said, or you know, again, when you're writing, you want concision. You want it to be tight, because if it's real wordy, people don't want to read it. I'm speaking as an author, right?
Right.
So, but you have these very wordy things, and those are Semitism. That's how the Jews express themselves in this kind of full way. So why did they include that if it would go against their readership? You know,
Right.
it'd be more difficult for them to read.
You say the Greek canonical texts are generally dated Mark 68 to 70, Matthew and Luke 85 to 90, John 90 to 110. You said Matthew's material could have been written a few years after the resurrection. Luke's date between 40 to 60. This was Claude Tresmontant. I guess his theory, Mark around 80, 50 or 60. And his point was, and it's a good point to say, if the Gospels were written at or after AD 70, how did they all miss the prophetic elephant in the room?
Yeah, yeah, right.
Which was
the destruction of Jerusalem, right?
A minor thing, you know.
Yeah, and Jesus spoke a lot about that prophetically. Why would you drop the ball when they go through and like every little thing Jesus says, they say that fulfills the scripture, yet you miss the destruction of Jerusalem? That doesn't make sense.
Well, you talk about peppering Semitisms in here. You also talk about salt and strange salt.
Yeah.
Why did you talk about salt? What was the point you wanted to make?
Yeah, because if you look at the Gospels, there's this little variation. One Gospel says that if salt loses its taste, it's good for nothing. In other words, if salt gets strange, it's good for nothing. Why the differences in the Gospels? Well, Jean Carmagnac, which I rely on that chapter, he points out that the Hebrew root can mean one of two different ways, because there weren't vowels. It depends on how you put the vowels in. It can mean saltless or tasteless, or it could mean strange or weird. And of course, they both overlap, right? They both say the same thing, but why the gospel is one way and why the other? That shows that there must have been an underlying Hebrew that when the Greek was being translated, one put the vowels in one way, the other one put them in the other.
You also talk formatted for accurate recall, because it talks about the idea, as Josephus says, that the Jews really cared about record keeping. The Romans were pretty good at record keeping too. Yeah. You talk about rhyme and rhythm, that they contain rhymes, rhythm, if in a song, a melody. And you say the weakest of the three in terms of memory aids in these things is the melody.
Yeah.
How so?
Yeah, you know, it's funny, you can remember nursery rhymes you learned when you were a tiny little kid.
I saw you got that in the book
Righty
there.
tighty, lefty loosey, right?
Right.
Why? Because there's a rhyming pattern and there's also a rhythm pattern. And same thing with songs. Sometimes songs just stick in your head, and you could do a really lengthy song and probably get all the words right because of the rhyme and the rhythm and the story. And melody you can forget, but when it comes down to rhyme and rhythm, those seem to be the core ones that stick in our mind.
Yeah, we used to get a lot of those, and then they decided that wasn't a good way to teach.
Yeah, right.
But I still remember the homes for the lakes, the Great Lakes. You just remember homes. Parallelism. What's parallelism?
Yeah, this is Hebrew poetry. Now, I don't like poetry, but I like Hebrew poetry because it doesn't rhyme words, it rhymes ideas. And so with Hebrew poetry, what they'll do is they'll take two different lines, and sometimes they'll parallel one another or they'll contrast it. Sometimes they will sometimes expand on the first line. So there's all these different kinds of poetry. And if you're reading the New Testament, sometimes you think it's just Bibleese. That's just the way they talked. But actually what's going on there is they're using the Hebrew poetry, this parallelism. And the beautiful thing about that, Doug, is if you forget one component, you could fill in the component by knowing the parallel, right? So, for example, if you have something that contrasts the lines, and if you can remember the positive one, all you have to do is just think of the negative, and you got the second line back in your memory.
Now, in Chapter 5, Dare to Verify, formatting the Gospels accurate calls one thing, proving that what is reported is true is quite another. And you kind of talk about even some of the early church fathers in the last chapter, Irenaeus, or I don't know if you went into Origen, whatever. Was it Irenaeus or Ignatius who thought Jesus was a little older than maybe most people thought? Who was the miracle worker in the basement?
Oh, yeah, I do a few thought experiments. And basically what I want to do is show how can you verify, because not everything is verifiable. So I say, let's propose there's a miracle worker, heals somebody in the basement. How can you verify that? Well, the only way you could do it is to interview the miracle worker and the person that's healed. And maybe look in the medical records. But so what I do is then I expand it. Okay, let's say there's 12 people there along with the person that's healed. Now you got witnesses. Then I take it out of the basement. And as we go through this thought experiment, what I show is you eventually get to the point where it's almost impossible to perpetrate a hoax. An unstaged audience at different locations, different times, multiple witnesses, even hostile witnesses, people that wanted to debunk.
Right. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
Two things you say. If 4 persons conspired, these are the writers of the gospel, to perpetrate a hoax by writing historical fiction about a miracle worker, it would have been in their best interest to make the story as unverifiable as possible. The locations of notable events would be vague or unidentifiable, rather than trying to be specific.
Yes. Yeah, and we find examples of that in some pseudo-Christian groups as well. They'll have sacred books that there's just no way you can verify what's going on in their books.
But you talk about the Gnostics later in here too.
Yeah, well, even contemporary ones as well. Yeah.
Oh, right. You talk also about the Gospels, however, do not shy away from giving specifics, and then to go to the point you made before, hostile witnesses in the New Testament, and I thought that was interesting on page 76. That idea of what you talk about as the ancient version of the double dog dare, as opposed to the triple dog dare.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so they didn't jump ahead to the triple dog dare. No. But the idea that, of course, you have these situations where these people who were critical of what Jesus was doing had to admit that he was doing something that they couldn't explain.
Yes, exactly. So they had to explain it away, right? But what's interesting, Doug, and I point that in my book, The Dare to Verify, is in the New Testament you have occasions where the gospel writers dare people to check into it. And for example, in the Bread of Life discourse, where Jesus says you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. Right. And if you ever notice, right when Jesus is giving this incredible teaching and his disciples are being turned off by it, the narrator just jumps in and interrupts the whole thing and says, these things were done in the synagogue of Capernaum, and then it just goes back to the narrative.
Right.
So it's like, why, John, did you have to jump into the narrative just to tell us where he's saying this? Well, I think that's a dare to verify.
Right.
It's like, if you doubt Jesus is saying this, just go to the synagogue of Capernaum, ask them.
Right, and also just the idea that if this occurred and people left him, and you were trying to make it look like a nice story, why would you have anybody not believe him?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's lots of embarrassing things that are included in there.
That you would think that somebody, and you talk about the verification of meaning, because that's the other point you make, and you talk about the telephone game, that, okay, maybe that's what was said, but are we sure we're getting the meaning of what was said?
Yeah. And I've run into a lot of atheists on social media that will say, okay, fine, let's say the Gospels are accurate, and let's say the writings we have today correspond to the originals. Who's to say what's the true meaning? It's everybody's guess what Jesus meant.
Besides, well, truth is individual, the world we live in today.
Yeah, so what I do is, so I think what's happened is, especially with evangelical research, is they've missed the church, right? The church is what verifies what's said, that they could verify it because the church is a tangible society. They could ask people, they could talk to pastors that knew the apostles. They could verify the meaning of text. And in my book, I do a thought experiment where we go in the Wayback Machine and go centuries to see how can we verify this message.
You and Mr. Peabody, huh?
That's right. Yeah.
Were you filling in for Sherman in that particular one? So, what when you were going through this, did anything surprise you, or what do you think? What have you found that people have been the most, like, had the most aha moment about that clicked for them?
Yeah. Well, hopefully, for me, the amount of information and skill it took to produce these writings known as the Gospels is just astounding. That Jesus could do that. I think that's actually a proof that he's divine, because I don't think anybody could do that. But the thing is, if you take the church seriously, like I do in my book, not only can you say the copies of the Gospels correspond to our copies, but you can also get the whole suite of, we can know that it's true, and that we can know the canon, which books belong in the Bible.
Right, which you talk about later in the book.
Yeah.
Okay, another book in the works?
Yeah, I'm working on one on the Messiah, so that's been a lot of fun.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. Pleasure having you on. Gary Michuta, the author of The Gospel Truth, How We Can Know What Christ Taught. Emmaus Road Publishing, available naturally through our EWTN Religious Catalog. EWTNRC.com for all things Catholic. Check this book out and check us out next time right here on Bookmark. Thanks for joining us.